We're on the last lecture of the organic molecules, and this time we're going to be talking about lipids and how they are an important part in the body. First of all, let's just talk very briefly about what exactly lipids are in the first place. Probably the key number one essential thing you need to know about lipids is that they are hydrophobic. They do not like water. The reason they do not like water is because they do not have those partial positive and negative charges we normally associate with things that are water soluble. Remember, the partial positive and negative charges that we see in things such as water or in sugars or in parts of amino acids is due primarily to oxygen being very electron greedy and holding on to electrons very closely and pulling them away from things like hydrogen atoms are bonded to, and that creates those partial positive and negative charges. Well, if we look at lipids, lipids contain few, if any, oxygens. They are primarily just very, very long chains of carbons and hydrogens with perhaps an occasional oxygen attached or other types of molecules. But really, in essence, they are very, very, very long chains of carbons and hydrogens with this should say a very high hydrogen to oxygen ratio, meaning lots and lots of hydrogens, very, very few, if any, oxygens. So because there aren't very many oxygens present, that means that you don't have very many of those partial positive and negative charges, and as a result, lipids just don't mingle well with water. And I think we all intuitively know this. If you ever take a sink full of dirty, greasy pans, fill it up with water, what happens to the grease in the pans? Well, it, of course, floats up to the surface of the water and forms large blobs on the surface. It certainly doesn't dissolve in the water like a sugar would. And that, again, is because of its hydrophobic nature. One of the other points I want to make about lipids is one I mentioned previously when I was talking about carbohydrates, and that's that lipids have an incredibly high caloric content per unit weight. In lipids, we see about 9.3 kilocalories of energy per gram, as opposed to in carbohydrates it was about 4.3 kilocalories per gram, or about half as much. So these lipids have an ability to store large quantities of energy in a gram of weight. Now, there are lots of different types of lipids out there, and I'm going to talk briefly about 5 types. Your book doesn't highlight all of these, but I want to just briefly at least mention them. Fatty acids are a very common type of lipid, and we've all heard about saturated fatty acids, unsaturated fatty acids, monosaturated fatty acids, polysaturated fatty acids. These are all terms that are probably common to you because we know about them in terms of what some scientists believe are their damaging effects on our heart health and blood vessel health. There are other researchers that don't think they're as harmful as they're made out to be. And it depends. Saturated fatty acids, or those like butter or animal fats, things that are solid at room temperature, are generally agreed to be more damaging potentially to your heart and to your blood vessels than are unsaturated fatty acids. Those are the oils, the ones that are liquid at room temperature. Things like vegetable oil, peanut oil, soybean oil, etc. What makes a fatty acid saturated versus unsaturated? Well, a saturated fatty acid has the maximum number of hydrogens possible, maximum hydrogens possible. It means every single carbon on there that could have a hydrogen on it has a hydrogen on it. But compared to unsaturated fatty acids, do not have the maximum number of hydrogens. And you think, well, why should we care about that, Carrie? Well, in Chem 130, they will talk more about this, or you may have already heard about this, that number of hydrogen atoms actually plays a crucial role in determining whether that fat is solid at room temperature or liquid at room temperature, and it also determines how it interacts in your body and what damage it may cause. But that's as detailed as we're going to get. You should at least know the difference between saturated and unsaturated in terms of which is liquid, which is solid at room temperature, and which has more hydrogen, which has fewer hydrogen. Sterols is another class, or often called steroids, are another class of carbohydrates. I'm sorry, of lipids and steroids all have a basic structure to them, and you can see it right here. I'm going to draw a circle around it here. They all have cholesterol as their base molecule. And then if we alter that cholesterol molecule by attaching or removing what are called functional groups or little atoms and molecules to that cholesterol molecule, we can make things like androgen, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone. All of these different types of what we know of as sex hormones are all derivatives of cholesterol. So they are all types of steroids. And all steroids have this 4-ring structure, 4 carbon rings. One thing to note about cholesterol is that 85% of the cholesterol in your blood, your own body manufactures. Your liver is your primary cholesterol manufacturing site in the body, and it makes 85% of all the cholesterol you have. Only 15% of the cholesterol in your body typically comes from diet, unless you have a genetic deficiency called familial hypercholesterolemia, but that's a pretty rare condition. For most people, your cholesterol is determined primarily by production from the liver. A third class of lipids are triglycerides. These are very common in the foods we eat. Sometimes they're called neutral fats. And they consist of a glycerol molecule, that's this guy here, it's a 3-carbon chain, with 3 long fatty acids attached to it. Okay, so it's a glycerol molecule with 3 long fatty acids. And I already discussed this idea of what's the difference between an oil and fat in terms of saturated and non-saturated fatty acids, so I don't need to return to that. Triglycerides are commonly found in our diet. We commonly digest them, and when we get to Bio 202, the second semester of Anatomy and Physiology, you're going to learn the complex process by which your digestive tract actually digests those triglycerides so that they can absorb them into the body. It turns out to be a real challenge because, remember again, lipids are not water soluble, and most of the enzymes and processes that occur in your small intestine to digest and absorb food that you've eaten are all dissolved in water. So digesting lipids becomes a very complex and challenging issue that we'll talk about again in Bio 202. Another category of lipids are very important to the body are phospholipids. Phospholipids are basically a glycerol molecule with 2 fatty acids attached. Here we go, glycerol molecule with 2 fatty acids attached and a phosphate group attached. Where we see these, and we're going to talk about them a lot, is in the plasma membrane of cells. The plasma membrane of cells is primarily a bilayer or a double layer of phospholipids. So we will return to that. So it's just a neutral fat with a phosphate group attached. Now because that phosphate group is attached, phosphate loves water, very hydrophilic. And the other side of the molecule where the fatty acids are, we know is very hydrophobic. It doesn't like water. So phospholipids are very interesting. A part of that molecule is very water-loving, hydrophilic, that's the phosphate part. A part of that molecule is very hydrophobic or water-fearing, that's the fatty acid part. So any molecule that contains both properties, it can be water-loving in one part and water-hating in another part, or water-fearing in another part, is called an amphiphilic molecule. Amphi means both. Think of an amphibian. That's an organism that can exist both in water and on land. Okay? Amphiphilic means both loving. It loves water, it loves fat. Last group that I'm going to mention, and I'm only going to mention them just very briefly, are the eicosanoids. This is a more, for our purposes at least this semester, a more obscure type of fatty acid or lipid. And they're pretty complex. They have 20 carbons in them. They include things such as prostaglandins and the name is escaping me right now. Other types of molecules, and these are primarily involved in things such as inflammation responses in the body, and we're really not going to discuss them at all this semester, but we will when you get to Bio 202. Now one thing I want to discuss at least very briefly are these things called trans fatty acids, because you hear about them all the time in the news, and now for a while now grocery stores have food manufacturers have been required to label that foods contain trans fatty acids or not contain trans fatty acids. And the question becomes, what exactly is a trans fatty acid? Well, a trans fatty acid is pretty much the same thing as a partially hydrogenated fat. Those two terms are interchangeable. Now, if you go back and think about what I said about a saturated fat, we said a saturated fat or a saturated lipid is one where it has a maximum number of hydrogens attached to the carbons. And because of that, it tends to be solid at room temperature, such as butter. On the other hand, unsaturated fats, remember, do not have the maximum number of hydrogens attached, and as a result, they are more of a liquid or an oil at room temperature, like the safflower oil. Partially hydrogenated fats are very interesting. They have been chemically modified, okay, in order to behave more like a saturated fat. So we start out with an unsaturated fat, one that's oil or liquid at room temperature, and we chemically force more hydrogens to bond to that lipid. And when we do that, it stops behaving like a liquid at room temperature and begins behaving more like a solid at room temperature. Now, why would the food industry do this? Well, it turns out that things that contain saturated lipids are tastier, and they're bulkier. They take up more space. So it's advantageous. People prefer the taste of saturated fats to unsaturated fats. So what the food industry has done is said, look, saturated fats that occur naturally, things like butter and fat off of meat, are relatively expensive. By comparison, unsaturated fats like vegetable oils are relatively inexpensive. So what they did is they took unsaturated fats, vegetable oils, and chemically induced them to behave more like saturated fats so they could get the qualities that we like with saturated fats, the fact that they're tasty and they make the food more bulky and things like that, but they were able to produce those qualities using a less expensive fat in the first place and modifying it chemically. Well, what's the bad news about that? Well, the bad news is studies have shown that having a lot of trans fat or partially hydrogenated fat in the diet actually raises your levels of LDL. LDL is the bad kind of cholesterol in your blood. So trans fats raise the bad kinds of cholesterol. They also, we believe, increase your risk of developing things like colon cancer, which also is not good. And this is why there was a big movement in the last couple of years to require all food companies to begin labeling whether there are trans fats present in the foods that they have. And I don't know if you've noticed, but I certainly have noticed in the last couple of years that many of the foods that used to contain large portions of trans fats have been redesigned so that they no longer contain that trans fat now that the companies have been required to put that on their label. Very interesting. Next up. All right, we just finished talking about lipids, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, and proteins, the 4 different types of organic molecules. And you might think to yourself, well, what's the point of knowing all this chemistry, Terry? Well, I'll give you a couple of reasons. One is, as we progress along in the rest of our Bio 181 exploration together, we will be commonly referring to these 4 types of organic molecules, and we will be commonly referring to basic chemistry, so it's good to know it for that. If you continue on and learn any anatomy and physiology, it's absolutely critical that you know these 4 types of organic molecules, what they look like, and generally how they behave. And if that doesn't persuade you enough, then hopefully this will. This was a question on Who Wants to be a Billionaire, not Who Wants to be a Millionaire, but they had a special show, Who Wants to be a Billionaire, back in 2004 on May 23rd. And their $500,000 question, the $500,000 question was this: which of these compounds in the human body is classified by scientists as a steroid? And the 4 answers were hemoglobin, cholesterol, insulin, and glucose. And if you know anything about the 4 types of organic molecules, you should be able to answer this question worth $500,000 without any thinking at all. Glucose is a sugar. Cholesterol, we just learned, is a lipid, and in fact it is the base molecule of all steroids, right? So it is the one that's classified by scientists as a steroid. And just if you're interested in knowing, Hemoglobin is a type of protein, and so is insulin. So you could have easily answered this question and won yourself a $500,000 just because you've gone through the first 4 or 5 weeks of Bio 181. So there's importance to knowing these organic molecules on many levels. I hope I persuaded you of that. And that concludes our lecture, and I'll see you in class.